For centuries, the image of the feudal lord claiming the first night of a newly married peasant woman became one of the darkest symbols of the Middle Ages. In 19th century romantic paintings, novels, and even in cinema, that scene is repeated. An arrogant nobleman, a terrified young woman, and the unquestionable authority of power over the body. This practice is known as ius primae noctis, or rite of the first night. But history, when examined carefully, shows a much more complex picture where myth and reality intertwine until they are indistinguishable. The term ius primae noctis does not appear in any medieval legal document with actual application. The authentic sources of feudal law do not mention a formal permission granted to lords to possess the brides of their serfs. What did exist was a set of customs, some deeply humiliating, that reinforced the social hierarchy between lord and vassal, and which over time were reinterpreted or exaggerated by later writers. One of these customs was the mercitum, a tax that the serf had to pay to the lord when his daughter got married. Its original meaning had nothing to do with sex, but with the loss of a worker on the lord's estate. However, its symbolic nature was clear. The body of the peasant woman did not fully belong to her or her family, but was part of the economy of the feudal domain. Some 13th century French chroniclers mention variants of the mercitum in which the payment could be replaced by a personal favor to the lord, but they do not detail its nature. That ambiguity was enough to fuel centuries of suspicion. The confusion intensified in the modern age when humanists, reformers, and anti-clerical chroniclers of the Renaissance began portraying the Middle Ages as an era of barbarism and abuse. Authors such as Voltaire or Montesquieu repeated the myth of the droit du seigneur to denounce feudal tyranny. In the 18th century, theatre and popular literature transformed it into a symbol of sexual oppression. Works such as Voltaire's Le Droit du Seigneur or Beaumarchais' Le Mariage de Figaro ridiculed the aristocrats who claimed that privilege, reinforcing the idea that it had once existed. In reality, the myth probably has older roots, linked to ritual or symbolic practices that, without being legal, reflected the structural inequality of medieval marriage. In some regions of northern France, Scotland, or Germany, the feudal lord had the right to attend his serf's wedding or to impose a blessing on the bride. That presence of the lord served as a reminder of dominance over his subjects, and over time popular imagination transformed that gesture into a physical intrusion. There is also an anthropological element that helped consolidate the myth. In many ancient and medieval societies, it was believed that the fertility or sexual power of the dominant man could be symbolically transmitted through contact with a subordinate's wife. That idea of a sexual blessing appears in Nordic chronicles, Celtic tales, and even in Near Eastern traditions. Although in Christian Western society the act itself would have been condemned by the Church, the echo of those beliefs persisted in peasant accounts and local legends. The few medieval records that allude to something similar to ius primae noctis are doubtful or clearly satirical. In Scotland, a 1427 text mentions that the bourgeois of certain towns paid a tax called culach to prevent the lord from exercising his supposed right over wives, but modern historians agree that it was an economic, not sexual tribute. In Catalonia, some local laws mention the cens de la doncella, a symbolic payment when marrying off a daughter without implying any physical contact. Modern historiography began to dismantle the myth in the 19th century, when philologists and jurists analyzed the original sources. The German Carl Schmitt in 1875 demonstrated that the supposed laws of ius primae noctis cited by the French encyclopedists were inventions or poor translations. Later in the 20th century, the French historian Alain Bourreau published a comprehensive study titled Le droit de cuissage, in which he traced the genealogy of the myth from the Middle Ages to Romanticism. His conclusion was clear. The right of the lord never existed as a legal institution, but did exist as a cultural fantasy, expressing fear of feudal power and class oppression. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that in medieval practice there were situations of abuse that could have given rise to the legend. The distance between lord and serf was abyssal, and the bodies of peasant women enjoyed no legal protection. Many lords took advantage of their authority to obtain sexual favors or impose coercion under threat of punishment or loss of land. These abuses, although not codified as a rite, were a tangible reality and likely fueled rumors that the Lord had sexual prerogatives over his serfs' brides. In villages, these stories were told as warnings, transmitted orally across generations. The Church, for its part, explicitly condemned any form of sexual intrusion outside legitimate marriage, but rarely intervened when the aggressor was a noble. Preachers and confessors warned against the sin of lordly lust. But Christian morality coexisted with a deeply hierarchical society, where justice was relative to social rank. In that context, the myth of the right of the Lord functioned more as a metaphor for the general subjugation of the peasantry than as a verifiable practice. Even so, the echo of the myth persisted. In medieval literature, the topic appears in a tone of mockery or social criticism. In French fabliaux, satirical tales of the 13th century, lascivious nobles and powerless serfs facing their power are depicted. In England, Chaucer alludes to similar figures in the Canterbury Tales. In all cases, the intention is not to describe a law, but to expose an injustice. The story of the Lord claiming the virginity of the bride is, ultimately, a parable about abuse of power and the humiliation of the weak. When the myth resurfaced in modern culture, it did so forcefully. In Enlightenment Europe, it was used to justify the need to end feudal privileges. In the 19th century, Romantic historians and painters revived it to stage medieval brutality, reinforcing the idea of a cruel and sensual Middle Ages. That vision, although anachronistic, prevailed in the collective imagination and survives today in films, novels, and historical series. The bedding ceremony. In the dim light of a medieval hall, barely illuminated by torches, a crowd laughs, sings, and drinks while a couple, often nervous and exhausted, is led to the marital bed. Behind them, the guests follow with jeers and shouts. There is no privacy, no intimacy. That scene, which today would seem a public humiliation, was in the Middle Ages a formal custom, the bedding ceremony. Its purpose was not so much to ensure consummation, but to seal the beginning of the marriage before witnesses. Yet the line between symbolic rite and grotesque spectacle was often thin. The bedding ceremony was common in Europe from the High Middle Ages well into the 17th century. In its simplest form, it consisted of accompanying the newlyweds from the banquet to the bedroom, where they were blessed before being left alone. However, in many places, especially among the nobility and northern European peasants, the ceremony took on a public and theatrical character. It was the culmination of marriage as a social contract. Words and mass were not enough. The body had to bear witness. In Scotland and England, the ritual began with the guests escorting the couple amid songs and risque jokes. Friends or family helped remove the couple's clothes, one on each side of the bed, while making comments about fertility, virility, or purity. In some villages, the godparents lifted the sheets to verify that both lay naked as a symbol of sincerity. Then they were wished good rest and many children, and the door was closed. Only then was the marriage considered complete. In France, the custom took on a more ritualized tone. Guests carried lit torches while singing wedding rhymes. The priest or the bride's father offered a final blessing, sometimes sprinkling the bed with holy water. In palaces, the ceremony could be a political act. Kings, princes, and high-ranking nobles celebrated the consummation of dynastic marriages before entire courts. In these cases, the entrance to the bed was witnessed by official witnesses, tasked with certifying that the union had been consummated. What appeared to be a gesture of public faith could become a spectacle of control. Among peasants, the tone was different. In English, German, or Flemish villages, the bedding ceremony became a boisterous party, often fueled by alcohol. It was a mix of celebration and mockery, a reaffirmation of the social order where sex, work, and fertility were intertwined. In some villages, the bed song was performed, with neighbors surrounding the house, singing obscene verses until the lights went out. If the couple took too long, the silence could be interpreted as a bad omen. In Germany and Scandinavia, the variations were even more explicit. There are documented cases where guests physically accompanied the couple to the bed, partially undressed them, and placed both under the sheets. In regions of Saxony, the groom had to raise a cup and drink over the bride's belly, a symbol of fertility. Priests simply reinterpreted the rite as a collective blessing without interfering in its carnal aspect. If the couple failed to consummate the union, rumors spread quickly, and the marriage could be annulled or questioned. For this reason, the ritual, though uncomfortable, was considered necessary. Reputation depended on it. In the highest strata, the ceremony had political value. Royal houses needed to ensure offspring and alliances. In 1429, the wedding of Henry VI of England and Margaret of Anjou was followed by a bedding ceremony witnessed by courtiers and ladies-in-waiting who signed a record confirming that the couple shared the bed. On other occasions, the act was merely symbolic. Witnesses saw the newlyweds lie down clothed or kiss under the blankets and then left. The document sealed the union, even if the real consummation occurred later. The bedding ceremony also had a surveillance component. In rural communities, the group served to ensure that the marriage was consummated and thus valid in the eyes of God and society. Intimacy did not belong to the individuals but to the collective. Marriage meant entering a network of expectations: fertility, obedience, permanence. The body was not a private space but an extension of collective morality. In that context, the first night became a public scene disguised as a ritual. Over time, these ceremonies began to decline. The 16th century brought with it a new notion of modesty and privacy influenced by humanism and the religious reform. The church started to look with suspicion at noisy celebrations and obscene games. In 1563, the Council of Trent established stricter rules for Christian marriage, and although it did not explicitly prohibit the bedding ceremony, it discouraged it. The upper classes began to consider it vulgar, suitable only for peasants. Still, in rural regions of England and Germany, it persisted well into the 17th century, transformed into a simple procession or symbolic blessing. Behind the folklore, the bedding ceremony reveals an essential aspect of the medieval world: the absence of the modern concept of intimacy. The wedding night did not belong to the couple, but to the community that observed, judged, and sanctioned. It was a ritual display of marital duty and social control over sexuality. What today would be understood as humiliation was then an act of moral and economic validation. Marriage, more than a union between individuals, was a pact between families and a transaction between lineages. Virginity tests and the stained cloth. The dawn after the marriage did not bring calm. In many medieval villages, the true test of a union was not measured by vows or blessings, but by a red stain on a white cloth. That piece of linen, displayed before relatives or neighbors, was considered the physical testimony of the bride's virginity and, therefore, the guarantee of her purity and the honor of two lineages. The stained cloth became a feared and revered symbol, a judgment that hung over every woman like a social sentence. Female virginity was, in the Middle Ages, a moral and economic capital. Its preservation defined the family's reputation, affected dowries, marriage contracts, and prestige in the community. From nobility to peasants, a woman's body was seen as property to be delivered intact to the husband. The hymen, a thin membrane with no relevant physiological function, was transformed into an absolute symbol of chastity. Doctors and clerics described it as a natural seal, a divine proof of honor. Its rupture, they believed, had to produce visible blood. If that sign did not appear, dishonor could ruin entire lives. The ritual of the stained cloth varied according to the region. In some areas of France and Spain, the linen was placed on the bed before the act. In the morning, the women closest to the bride, such as the mother, sisters, midwives, or neighbors, came to examine it. If there were bloodstains, triumphal songs were sung, and the cloth was hung in the window or shown publicly as a symbol of virtue. If not, silence became heavy, and shame could fall like a sentence. In Scotland and parts of Germany, the ritual was more discreet. The witnesses waited outside the room, and the husband, upon leaving, had to declare whether his wife had been found a virgin. His word was enough to legitimize or destroy a reputation. The belief in the bloody proof was so strong that in many cases the absence of blood was interpreted as proof of impurity or adultery, without considering that countless natural causes could explain the result: elastic hymens, previous loss due to physical activities, or simply a different anatomy. But medieval medical thought was dominated by symbolism, not anatomy. It was assumed that female blood, mixing with male semen, sealed the marital union and guaranteed fertility. Not bleeding was therefore a bad omen. In medical and Christian moral texts, the topic appears with an obsessive tone. Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century wrote that virginity was a divine gift that shone in the bodies of pure women. The Italian Dr. Trotta of Salerno, one of the few female figures in medieval medicine, described the hymen in clinical terms, but her work was reinterpreted by men who added moral notions. In the manuals of confessors, priests instructed husbands to verify the purity of their wives with moderation, although they never condemned the practice. Theology justified control, and ignorance turned it into superstition. Among peasant strata, the test acquired a community character. The wedding night was not a private act, and the bride's body symbolically belonged to the village. When the cloth was shown at dawn, the neighbors celebrated with music, toasts, and mocking comments. If the test failed, the same community could impose punishments, ridicule, defamation, and even annulment of the marriage. In some towns of Castile or Normandy, the husband had the right to return the woman to her family and demand financial compensation. It was the medieval equivalent of a public sentence with no possibility of defense. In nobility, the ritual acquired a political dimension. Marriages between powerful houses were alliances of blood and territory. A failure in the test could unleash conflicts. In the 14th century, King Edward II of England faced a scandal when rumours spread that his wife Isabella had not bled on her first night, which cast doubt on the legitimacy of her offspring. In France, some marriages were annulled after medical examinations and testimonies about the lost honour of the wives. These cases reinforced the idea that virginity was not an intimate matter but a matter of state. Manipulation was also common. Many women resorted to desperate methods to simulate the test, pricking themselves with needles, hiding animal blood in the sheets, or using natural dyes. Popular medical treatises mention mixtures of chicken blood, wine, and herbs that mimicked the stain. Lying was dangerous, but sometimes the only defense against a system that admitted no explanations. Some mothers instructed their daughters before marriage, teaching them how to prepare the cloth in secret, knowing that their future depended on that stain. Midwives and birth attendants occupied an ambiguous role. They were the guardians of purity and, at the same time, accomplices in deception. Their knowledge of the female body made them feared and respected. Control over virginity was not only physical, but moral and religious. The Church, although it did not directly promote the cloth test, endorsed purity as an essential virtue. Sermons insisted that a woman's body must remain closed until marriage and that the blood of the first night represented the surrender of the soul. In many devotional texts, the bride was compared to the Virgin Mary, a symbol of perfect chastity. This idealization transformed sexuality into sin and shame into virtue. Women learned from childhood that their worth depended on a visible sign of suffering, but not all Christian cultures shared the same intensity in the ritual. In Italy, where the Renaissance began to transform customs, the test lost force from the 15th century onward. In contrast, in more rural regions of Central and Northern Europe, it survived well into the early modern period. Even in the 18th century, Scottish and German chroniclers still described the custom of hanging the cloth in the window, though now as a symbolic gesture. The stain became a folkloric tradition, emptied of its judicial power but not of its moral weight. The most significant aspect of that ritual was not the cloth, but fear of failing, of being pointed out, of carrying irredeemable shame. In a society that turned honor into currency, the female body became the canvas on which the destiny of entire families was written. The stained cloth was not just a test of virginity, but a form of social control, a confirmation that the community could monitor even the most intimate. Consent versus contract. In the Middle Ages, getting married was not an act of love, but a social transaction. Marriages united lands, sealed alliances, or guaranteed inheritances. But within this web of convenience and power, the Church began to impose a radical idea for its time, that marriage, in the eyes of God, was only valid if there was mutual consent from the spouses. It was a doctrine that clashed head-on with family practices, where the body and will of young people were subordinated to the interests of their parents or lords. In this conflict between consent and contract, one of the most silent and consequential battles of the Middle Ages was fought. Canon law, developed by theologians and jurists of the Church since the 12th century, established a fundamental principle: consensus facit nuptias, that is, consent makes the marriage. It was enough for a man and a woman to declare their willingness to be husband and wife, even without witnesses, for the union to be considered legitimate. This interpretation, recorded in the Decretum Gratiani of 1140, broke with centuries of feudal tradition. Until then, marriages were family pacts and economic contracts, closed through the delivery of a dowry or an agreement between guardians. Love and personal choice rarely had a place in that scheme. The new ecclesiastical doctrine sought to Christianize customs. For the Church, consent was an expression of free will, a reflection of divine will in the souls of men. However, in practice, freedom of choice was an almost non-existent privilege. Among the nobility, marriages continued to be political strategies, among peasants, an economic obligation. Young people barely participated in the decisions that marked their lives. The signing of a marriage contract, the delivery of a dowry, or the presence of a priest was enough to seal the union, even if the couple barely knew each other. This mismatch between doctrine and custom generated countless conflicts. In ecclesiastical courts, cases of secret or clandestine marriages began to multiply, in which a couple claimed to have married of their own will without family authorization. Many of these cases involved young people who fled parental control, seeking refuge in the religious promise of freedom. But freedom had limits. If the marriage did not have witnesses or the approval of the community, it could be declared null or invalid. Families, upon discovering it, resorted to force or blackmail to separate the spouses. In a world ruled by reputation and property, individual consent proved fragile against collective pressure. The clash was especially violent among the upper classes. Marriages between nobles were negotiated from childhood. Promises of alliance were sealed in writing, and breaking them could trigger wars. The Church, although defending consent, usually accepted the authority of parents when it came to preserving peace between lineages. In many cases, young people were forced to swear loyalty before God without even having a conversation with each other. For women, the situation was even more restrictive. Their consent was often presumed, not expressed. Silence or obedience was enough. Canon law tried to establish rules to resolve these tensions. It distinguished between matrimonium de presenti, that is, the union consummated through present consent, and matrimonium de futuro, which consisted of a promise of marriage. The latter had to be fulfilled later through consummation. The difference was not minor. Many families took advantage of the future commitment to secure alliances without allowing the betrothed to truly get close. Thus, marriages arranged between children were born, in which the word was spoken years before the physical act. Ecclesiastical jurists faced impossible dilemmas. What to do when a young woman claimed to have been married against her will, but the contract had been signed by her father? Or when a man declared that he had secretly joined with a woman and then married another by order of his family? The church courts tasked with judging these disputes became arenas of intrigue and contradictory testimonies. Preserved documents show cases of young people appealing to the Pope to annul forced marriages and families using their influence to silence those voices. One of the best-known cases was that of Inés de Mérida, a 13th-century young woman promised from childhood to an older man to consolidate a feudal alliance. Shortly before the wedding, she declared before a priest that she had given her consent to another man whom she loved in secret. Her testimony triggered a canonical trial that lasted years. The Church, although recognizing the validity of her word, ultimately ruled in favor of the family contract, arguing that marriage had to serve the social order. The message was clear. Consent was sacred, but subordinate to convenience. Age also became a central issue. According to canon law, the minimum age for marital consent was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. The justification was theological. It was assumed that at that age people reached the maturity of the soul and the capacity to understand the sacrament. But in practice, this rule legitimized child marriages, where consent was purely symbolic. Girls did not understand the terms of the union, nor the risks it implied. The Church defended the spirituality of the bond, but reality showed the harshness of a system that confused obedience with consent. Despite the contradictions, ecclesiastical doctrine introduced a fundamental change in the history of Western marriage. For the first time, individual will was recognized as an essential element. Marriage ceased to be a mere civil or family contract and became a personal sacrament. But that progress coexisted with everyday brutality. Many women were still forced, many girls were promised, and the idea of consent barely survived between the margins of religious ideal and feudal practice. In sermons and manuals of confessors, theologians insisted that the marital act must be carried out without violence and with mutual agreement, but the limits of that norm were vague. What did consent mean when the body was someone else's property? What freedom could a wife exercise in a world where disobedience was punished as sin or crime? Canon law proclaimed a freedom that the social order denied every day. The conflict between consent and contract was never fully resolved. The Church, which had wanted to protect individual will, ended up blessing arranged marriages, political alliances, and forced unions. And while jurists debated the validity of promises, the lives of thousands of women were consumed in the silence of an imposed duty. Child marriage and guardianship. In the stone castles and lost villages of medieval Europe, child marriages were not the exception, but the norm. In a society that saw marriage as a political, economic, or spiritual tool, age was a minor detail. Girls were promised before understanding the meaning of the words that bound them, and their bodies became a guarantee of alliances that sealed fortunes, territories, or noble titles. Childhood, as we understand it today, did not exist. Childhood was not a space of freedom, but a stage that had to be shortened to serve the family and social order. Canon law, consolidated from the 12th century onwards, set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for women and 14 for men. That provision, intended to protect spiritual maturity, ended up legitimizing countless abuses. In practice, engagements took place much earlier. Child marriage was a strategy of survival and power. Among the nobility, it served to secure inheritances and dynastic alliances. Among peasants, it responded to the need for economic stability. Marrying a daughter early meant fewer mouths to feed and a new source of labor or dowry. Children were pieces on a board they did not understand. Their futures were decided by adults in council meetings or banquets, where each marriage promise was equivalent to a transaction. In many cases, the betrothed did not even meet until the wedding day. Marriage contracts usually established a key figure, the guardian or tutor. This person acted as the legal representative of the minor, negotiated the terms of the agreement, and was responsible for safeguarding the dowry or associated properties. In theory, their role was to protect the child's interests. In practice, guardianship became an instrument of power. Many tutors used their authority to control or exploit their wards, especially if they were heiresses of fortune. The guardian decided when and to whom the minor should marry and could impose their will under the argument of moral or economic protection. In extreme cases, the tutor became the future husband. Numerous records exist of nobles and clerics who, after being appointed guardians of an orphaned girl, ended up marrying her once she reached the legal age. The Church permitted it as long as there was consent, a word emptied of meaning under these circumstances. The age difference could be enormous. A 40-year-old man marrying a 12-year-old girl was seen as an honorable act, not a scandal. The child's body was considered potentially fertile, a seed that had to be cultivated to produce heirs. Among the lower classes, the phenomenon took on different nuances. In peasant villages, girls often married young, sometimes before 15, driven by economic necessity and social pressure. Early fertility was valued, and the union served as a guarantee of labor and stability. The family gave the daughter along with a modest dowry, whether a chest, a cow, or a plot of land, thus ensuring her future sustenance. But many of these girls went directly from paternal obedience to marital obedience, never knowing the possibility of choice. Guardianship changed hands, but the power remained the same. Civil and canon law tried to establish distinctions between future betrothals, promises of marriage made in childhood, and consummated marriages. According to the law, a child engagement could be annulled if one of the parties rejected the union upon reaching the age of consent. However, in practice, such annulments were almost impossible. Family pressure, debts of honor, and political alliances ensured that engagements were fulfilled without question. A word given, even by a child, carried the weight of law. The effects of these marriages were devastating. Many girls died during consummation or in early childbirth, unable to withstand the physical burden of early motherhood. Ecclesiastical records from the 13th and 14th centuries show an alarming increase in deaths from infections, hemorrhages, or premature births among young wives. Physicians of the time, influenced by the theory of humours, recommended that women marry and bear children as soon as nature allowed, confusing biological maturity with moral destiny. In that thinking, the female body was seen as a resource to be used, not protected. The Church, caught between its doctrine of consent and social customs, adopted an ambiguous position. In their sermons, preachers exalted the purity of young married virgins, presenting them as models of Christian obedience. But there were also critical voices. In the 13th century, theologian Thomas Aquinas warned about the dangers of premature marriages and noted that forced consent could not be considered valid. His position, however, was a minority one. Most clerics considered child marriage a necessary evil to preserve order and morality. Cases of resistance were rare but not non-existent. In some convents, young brides-to-be found temporary refuge, seeking to escape imposed marriages. Some managed to have the Pope annul their engagements by claiming coercion, but such victories were exceptional. In most cases, girls were returned to their families and forced to fulfill their role. Love, when it existed, was an accident, obedience, an obligation. In the legal sphere, the figure of guardianship consolidated the notion that women, regardless of age, always needed a male representative: the father, the husband, or the guardian. This legal dependence persisted for centuries, even beyond the Middle Ages. Laws did not recognize women as autonomous subjects of rights. Their consent, though theoretically essential, was always understood within the framework of obedience. The freedom of choice, proclaimed by canon law, faded before the weight of custom and family authority. In practice, guardianship perpetuated the idea that a woman's body had to be managed by others. From child engagement to consummation, every step was monitored, every decision mediated. Marriage was not a union between equals, but a transfer of power, from the father's hand to the husband's, from the contract to the bed. This continuity of dominion, invisible in documents, was felt in daily life as a chain. Domestic violence and lack of legal classification. In medieval society, marriage was not a space of equality, but a domestic hierarchy. The husband represented absolute authority within the home, and the wife, subordinate to him by law, custom, and religion, was obliged to obey. That obedience was not symbolic, but concrete. Conjugal violence, whether physical, sexual, or psychological, was not only tolerated but understood as part of the natural order of things. Love was not part of the marital contract, submission was. The law of the time defined the family as an extension of the fief. Just as the lord ruled over his serfs, the man ruled over his wife. Medieval legal codes, both civil and canonical, granted the husband the duty to correct his wife if she disobeyed or acted against his honor. That correction could include physical punishment. In practice, the line between discipline and abuse was non-existent. As long as the punishment did not endanger the woman's life, authorities rarely intervened. Roman law, still influential in the Middle Ages, had already established the figure of the pater familias, who could dispose of the bodies under his roof. Germanic law, for its part, legitimized reasonable violence as a means of control. In the Castilian fueros of the 13th century, the husband was recognized the authority to reprimand and punish his wife in cases of infidelity or disobedience. In England, common law introduced the notion that a man could strike his wife with a stick the thickness of his thumb, a phrase that centuries later would be remembered as the infamous rule of thumb. The phrase never existed as written law, but reflected a mentality. Physical correction was a marital right. In the religious sphere, domestic violence was also not openly condemned. Sermons and confessor manuals advised moderation, not prohibition. The Spanish theologian Martín de Azpilcueta in the 16th century warned that the husband should correct his wife with discretion and without fury, as a shepherd guides his flock. Thomas Aquinas himself considered that a woman should endure blows as part of her marital duty to maintain household peace. In Christian morality, female suffering became a virtue, a test of patience, humility, and faith. This theological interpretation was supported by a literal reading of Scripture. In St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, it said, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife." That phrase was cited for centuries as justification for male dominance. Marriage was understood as a chain of obedience, God over man, man over woman. In that scheme, violence was not seen as a deviation, but as a tool of discipline. Civil authorities barely intervened in domestic conflicts. Medieval courts rarely prosecuted cases of marital violence unless they ended in homicide. In the judicial records of England, France, or Castile, cases of wives beaten or raped by their husbands are almost non-existent, not because they did not occur, but because they were not considered crimes. Private life was the domain of the man, and justice was not to interfere in his home. Neighbors could know, midwives could see, confessors could hear, but all remained silent. Sexual violence within marriage was also not codified. The notion of marital rape did not exist. Sexual intercourse was considered a duty of the wife and a right of the husband. Confessor manuals indicated that the woman should submit without resistance whenever the husband requested it, even if she did not desire the act. Refusal could be interpreted as the sin of rebellion or as cause for annulment of the marriage. In that logic, the female body had no right to consent within the marital bond. Conjugal duty erased any possibility of refusal. In contemporary testimonies, some women tried to report abuse to ecclesiastical courts, but their voices were lost in the legal void. Records preserved in the archives of Rouen or Bologna show petitions from wives begging for separation due to intolerable cruelty, bloody blows, or fear of death. In most cases, judges ordered them to reconcile or retreat temporarily to a convent without sanctioning the aggressor. Only in rare occasions was annulment granted, and only if impotence, infidelity, or heresy was proven. Violence alone was not sufficient. The absence of legal classification turned the home into a space of impunity. Pain was hidden behind walls, and shame prevented speaking out. Women learned to endure, to remain silent, to survive. Some resorted to folk remedies or domestic magic, amulets, prayers, sleep-inducing potions to calm their husbands. In villages, neighbors shared advice in hushed voices, passing down strategies to avoid male anger. It was silent knowledge, built from fear. Marital violence did not distinguish between classes. In castles, queens could be humiliated just as peasants in huts. The difference lay in the scandal. When abuse affected a noble figure, it became a matter of state. In 1313, Queen Margaret of Burgundy was publicly beaten by her husband, Louis V of France, accused of jealousy. The incident sparked a scandal that the church resolved with silence. Meanwhile, peasant women suffered in anonymity, without witnesses, without resources, without a name. Popular culture reflected this reality naturally. In fabliaux and epic songs, beaten wives were subjects of mockery or moral lessons. In moralizing tales, they were presented as guilty of their own punishment, gossipy, rebellious, or unfaithful women who deserved correction. Medieval humor turned pain into laughter, perpetuating the idea that domestic violence was an inevitable feature of married life. Thus, abuse was not only normalized but celebrated. Physical punishment was even considered a form of love. In 15th century moral literature, husbands were advised to punish with a just hand and a tender heart, as if violence were a demonstration of care. That rhetoric confused control with affection and turned cruelty into a domestic virtue. Female obedience was the foundation of family balance, male strength its guarantee. However, under this structure of dominance, cracks began to appear. Some late medieval jurists began to question marital impunity. In Italy and France, certain ecclesiastical courts recognized excessive cruelty as a legitimate cause for separation, though not for annulment. It was a minimal but symbolic change. The suffering of the wife began to be visible, even if still unpunished. Violence remained part of the order, but no longer entirely unquestionable. Annulment and non-consummation. In the Middle Ages, marriage was a prison blessed by the Church. Once consent was given and the act consummated, the union was indissoluble. Divorce, as understood today, did not exist. Only two possible exits remained: death or annulment. But obtaining an annulment was a long, humiliating, and almost impossible process. It required proving that the marriage had never truly existed, that it had been invalid from the beginning. Accepted causes included impotence, prohibited kinship, coercion, deception, or non-consummation, and in all cases bodies were called to testify. The Church considered marriage an indestructible sacrament reflecting the union between Christ and his Church. However, to maintain the purity of that ideal, it had to define the limits of its validity. If a marriage could not be fulfilled, whether because the marital act did not occur, there was no offspring, or one of the spouses concealed an incapacity, its annulment could be requested. In theory, the process sought moral truth. In practice, it became a judgment on intimacy. Ecclesiastical judges interrogated, examined, and exposed the most private details of married life before the clerical public. Diocesan tribunals and papal courts received hundreds of petitions each year. Many came from nobles and kings who needed to free themselves from inconvenient political marriages. Others came from wives claiming deception, abuse, or impotence. The case had to be presented with witnesses, documents, and, in some cases, medical examinations. Judges analyzed whether the marriage had been consummated, that is, whether the sexual act had occurred at least once. If not, the bond could be declared null, but proving it required invading the most intimate, the body, and shame. The judicial procedure was relentless. Witnesses could be servants, midwives, confessors, or neighbors who had observed or heard something. The questions were explicit. If they had seen signs of blood, if they had heard moans, if they had noticed impotence or rejection. In some cases, spouses were interrogated separately about the details of their encounter. The answers had to match in number of attempts, duration, position, or difficulty. The slightest error could discredit the testimony. Sexuality became a dossier. In cases of male impotence, the humiliation reached another level. Courts ordered physical examinations to determine whether the man was capable of acting as a husband. Sometimes he was forced to demonstrate his virility before witnesses or doctors appointed by the church. If he failed, the marriage could be annulled. But the process was so shameful that many preferred to bear the guilt rather than expose themselves. The sentences were recorded in archives, and the stigma accompanied them for life. Women, in turn, had to endure equally invasive examinations. When a wife claimed that her husband had not consummated the marriage, she underwent inspections by midwives or doctors to verify her virginity. The goal was to check whether the hymen remained intact. This practice, far from scientific, was an act of public humiliation. If the woman did not bleed during the examination, or if her anatomy appeared ambiguous, she was accused of lying. The court usually favored the man unless there was irrefutable evidence of impotence. Among the most common causes for annulment was prohibited kinship. The Church had defined an extensive network of degrees of consanguinity and affinity that spanned up to 7 generations. This made many marriages technically invalid. Noble families, accustomed to marrying relatives to preserve land and titles, found themselves in constant conflict with ecclesiastical laws. When politically convenient, this same prohibition served as a pretext to annul an undesirable marriage. It was enough to demonstrate a remote kinship to obtain nullity. Morality served convenience. Deception was also grounds for annulment. Hiding an illness, a previous religious vow, or a false identity could invalidate the union. Some cases bordered on the absurd, spouses discovering that their partner had been baptized under another name, or that they belonged to a bastard lineage. In those trials, judges analyzed birth certificates, baptismal records, and witness statements. Spiritual truth was decided with documents. Non-consummation cases were particularly cruel. It was assumed that marriage had to be physically proven, and the absence of the act was interpreted as disobedience or fraud. In many regions, the court could order a cohabitation test. Spouses were forced to share the bed for a determined period under indirect supervision. If, after that period, consummation was not achieved, the marriage could be annulled. In certain cases, servants had to certify that no movement was heard or that the bed remained intact. Privacy in practice disappeared. The social consequences were devastating. An annulled marriage was equivalent to a lifelong stain. The woman was labeled as infertile or frigid, the man as impotent or effeminate. Families lost prestige, economic contracts were broken, political alliances fractured. Conjugal failure was seen as divine punishment. In some towns, annulled women were removed from the community or sent to convents. Men, on the other hand, could remarry without difficulty. The weight of shame almost always fell on them. Ecclesiastical justice, even when ruling in favor of the wife, expelled her from the world. These proceedings reveal the level of control the Church exerted over intimate life. The spouses' bodies were moral property of the clergy. Sins, doubts, failures, everything was examined and classified. In confessors' manuals, priests were advised to question couples about their sexual conduct, whether they slept together, avoided the union, or used illicit artifices. The marital bed became a field of spiritual surveillance. There was no room for desire, only duty. However, behind these procedures hid a deeper tension. Annulment was not only a religious matter but also an economic one. Dowries, inheritances, and property rights depended on the validity of the marriage. Each ruling affected fortunes, titles, and territories. Ultimately, the purity of the sacrament served to maintain social and patrimonial order. Emotions did not matter, goods did. Dowries, bride price, and wedding settlements. In the Middle Ages, marriage was, above all, an economic transaction. The union between two people involved an exchange of goods, favors, or lands that ensured balance between families. Behind every ceremony, every promise, or every blessing, there existed a contract. The bride, more than an individual, was a measurable value in coins, animals, or property. Her dowry was the guarantee of the agreement, and her body the confirmation of the pact. The dowry represented the economic contribution that the bride's family gave to the husband to help support the new household. It could include coins, jewelry, livestock, or even land. Among the nobility, dowries reached exorbitant sums, castles, villas, or feudal rights. Among peasants, a dowry could consist of a cow or a sack of grain. In any case, the logic was the same. The woman entered marriage accompanied by an economic burden that determined her value and security. If the husband died, the dowry had to be returned. If she was repudiated, the money served as protection. In practice, however, few women managed to recover anything. Money passed from hand to hand, and with it, female independence. The arras, on the other hand, were the opposite symbol. The gift that the husband offered to the wife as a sign of commitment. In Christian theory, they represented the husband's love and responsibility. In reality, they functioned as an advance payment, a way to legitimize the purchase. The arras were made of gold or silver and were delivered publicly during the ceremony so that everyone could see that the deal was closed. Often the amount was equivalent to 1/10 of the husband's estate, although in practice it was negotiable. If the wife died without children, the arras returned to the husband. If he died first, the widow kept them as sustenance. It was a balance of appearances but not of power. Notarial records from France, England, and Castile preserve thousands of marriage contracts detailing these transactions. The woman always appears as a passive object, mentioned alongside the goods. For example, Juana, daughter of so-and-so, is delivered with so many maravedis, so many head of livestock, and a bed with linen sheets. Marriage was signed like a sale. Witnesses certified that both families were satisfied. Love did not appear in any clause. In the peasant world, where money was scarce, the dowry could be replaced with labor. The bride's father offered labor or harvests to the future son-in-law. Sometimes, the bride's price was paid with years of service. This labor for a wife was common in Germanic and Nordic regions where poor young men offered their strength in exchange for marriage. It was not a romantic gesture but a socially accepted barter. Those who could not pay did not marry, and those without daughters lost a valuable resource in the local economy. In the upper classes, the dowry's value became a tool of political power. A marriage could unite kingdoms or ruin lineages. 14th century chroniclers describe negotiations where the dowry's amount weighed more than the age or health of the bride and groom. A 13-year-old princess could be sent to another country along with a chest of gold and a retinue of servants. Her purpose was to secure an alliance, not a home. In these agreements, the female body became a diplomatic frontier, a means of peace between men. But even among the humble, the economic pressure of marriage was immense. A family unable to provide a dowry for its daughter was marked by shame. In some villages of Castile and Provence, communal funds existed, known as the dowries of poor maidens, supported by local charity to help young women without resources marry. Without a dowry, there was no marriage, and without marriage, there was no future. Misery condemned many women to convents or domestic servitude. The marital economy did not end with the wedding. In cases of conflict or widowhood, families argued over the return of the dowry. Disputes over conjugal property filled ecclesiastical courts. Some husbands squandered the money, others used it as collateral for debts. The woman, legally unable to manage property without her husband's permission, remained unprotected. Her fortune became an instrument of control, a reminder that her freedom was subject to the gold she brought and the bed she shared. Fertility rituals and superstitions. In the dimness of a medieval room, the wedding night was not merely a carnal act or a religious duty, it was a rite full of symbols and fears. The future of a family depended on that union, and fertility was its most awaited promise. In an era dominated by superstition, love mingled with magic, and the body became a field of invisible forces. The first night, amid prayers and amulets, was both a ceremony and a test, an invocation of life in the midst of darkness. Medieval thought regarded fertility as a divine blessing, but also as a phenomenon that had to be provoked or protected. Men feared impotence as much as women feared sterility. In sermons, clergy spoke of marriage as the only legitimate path to procreation, but the people resorted to their own means. Women wore herbs tied around their waists, men drank brews of honey and wine, and both repeated prayers combining poorly learned Latin with pagan formulas inherited from previous generations. Hot herbs were the most sought after: ginger, cinnamon, rue, fennel, mustard. Their inner fire was believed to stimulate desire and strengthen the body. Cold herbs, like mint or sage, were used to calm lust or prevent unwanted pregnancies. The balance of humours, blood, phlegm, or yellow and black bile, governed conception according to Galenic medicine. If the body was too cold or moist, the vital soul could not ignite the seed. Therefore, before the encounter, many husbands drank spiced wine or applied ointments promising immediate vigour. In some contemporary treatises, like the Tarquinum Sanitatis, it was recommended to eat almonds, figs, or onions to awaken the dormant nature. Superstitions were not limited to the body. In various regions of Europe, newlyweds followed symbolic rituals to attract fertility. Breaking a loaf of bread over the bed, hanging wheat sheaves, or placing a black cat under the bed as a guardian of the home. In France, midwives blessed the room with laurel branches and improvised prayers. In Scotland, the bride had to step barefoot on the ground before entering the bedroom, a gesture representing the connection to the fertility of nature. Marriage was not just between two people, but between bodies and the world that contained them. Popular magic offered bolder remedies. It was said that drinking goat's milk mixed with menstrual blood ensured male offspring, while spreading honey on the belly attracted fertility. In some Italian villages, women hid wooden figurines shaped like phalluses under the pillow, relics of ancient Roman cults. The church openly condemned these rituals, but its influence was weak outside the monasteries. In practice, peasants combined Christian faith with pre-Christian beliefs, forming a parallel religion of symbols, prayers, and amulets. The role of midwives was central. They were the guardians of the secrets of the female body, the ones who knew the phases of the moon, the herbs of the forest, and the signs of fertility. They were consulted before and after the wedding night, and their word carried more weight than that of the priests. Some prepared infusions to encourage conception, others taught methods to prevent it. Their knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter, made them ambiguous figures, necessary for life, suspicious to the church. Many would be persecuted centuries later under accusations of witchcraft, but in the heart of the Middle Ages they were the true keepers of intimate knowledge. The fear of infertility was profound. A childless marriage was considered a curse. The absence of offspring endangered inheritances and alliances, but also challenged the divine command to be fruitful and multiply. Sterile women were the subject of whispers, and impotent men of mockery and contempt. For both, failure in bed was a failure before the community. That is why the wedding night was not a moment of pleasure, but a public test disguised as private intimacy. Even among the nobility, where unions were political, the pressure was the same. Court physicians prepared potions with powdered deer horn or bezoar stone. Clerics recommended specific prayers to saints such as Margaret or Gilda Casanova, protectors of women in labor. Even kings resorted to superstition. It is said that Henry II of Castile, fearing his sterility, ordered a belt of relics to be hung above his bed before each conjugal night. The line between faith and magic vanished the very moment the candles went out. social control and family honor. In medieval villages, marriage did not belong to the couple, but to the community. It was a public matter, watched and commented on by everyone. The union of two families involved a network of commitments, expectations, and fears that extended beyond the marital bed. In a world where reputation was worth more than truth, family honor was a capital as fragile as it was necessary, and every gesture, every rumor could elevate or destroy entire generations. From the moment of the wedding, the newlyweds were under observation. The community had the right to know whether the union was legitimate, whether it had been consummated, and whether the bride had complied with the norms of purity. Neighbors, relatives, midwives, and even priests formed an informal surveillance network that controlled collective morality. In small villages, lives were known in detail, and intimacy was a luxury reserved for no one. Silence aroused suspicion, discretion, rumors. In this context, honor functioned as a mechanism of social control. Family honor did not depend solely on individual behavior, but on public judgment. A woman accused of infidelity, a man labeled impotent, or a wedding without proof of virginity could drag shame over an entire lineage. Gossip carried legal and religious weight. A malicious comment could lead to investigations or punishments. Ecclesiastical courts, although incapable of controlling all cases, acted as moral arbiters. Confessions and sermons reinforced the idea that the wife's purity and the husband's authority were pillars of divine order. Collective surveillance was exercised with cruel naturalness. Houses were open, walls were thin, and life was shared. On wedding nights, the songs, jokes, and comments of neighbors accompanied the consummation like a mandatory spectacle. In some French or German villages, newlyweds were awakened at dawn by groups of friends demanding to see the stained cloth or hear the first signs of the new marital life. If the couple did not meet expectations, the community reacted with mockery or symbolic punishments. It was the price of public failure. Control did not end on the wedding night. During the first months, fertility was watched anxiously. If the wife did not become pregnant, speculations began. Was she cursed, sick, or simply unworthy? The lack of children was a stigma. Women were the first to bear the blame, accused of being closed or cold. Men, on the other hand, could justify infertility by appealing to divine causes or bad luck. The moral scale always tipped to one side. In urban settings, honor became a currency of prestige. Guilds, fraternities, and corporations controlled the behavior of their members. A master craftsman could lose his reputation and with it his clientele if his wife was seen as unfaithful or disobedient. Public morality guaranteed economic stability. Among the upper classes, honor was measured in lineages. A suspicion of bastardy could alter inheritances and political alliances. That is why families closely monitored young women, restricting their movements and conversations. Freedom was a risk few were willing to take. Punishments for dishonor varied according to place and severity. In villages, public ridicule was the most common sanction. Parades with dolls representing the unfaithful, obscene songs, or popular trials. In larger cities, punishments could include exile or confinement in convents. In all cases, the goal was to restore social order and remind the community that honor was not a right, but a collective duty. Public shame became the most effective instrument of discipline. Honor also had an economic dimension. A dishonored family lost its ability to negotiate advantageous marriages. A daughter's dowry could be reduced or annulled if there were suspicions about her reputation. Women, aware of this, grew up learning that their body was a mirror of the family fortune. Silence, modesty, and obedience were virtues not only religious, but financial. A stain on honor could cost entire generations of stability. Against the backdrop of this constant surveillance, the community ensured its own balance. Moral control not only preserved faith, but also the economic structure of the fief or city. The reputation of families determined the value of their lands, the strength of their alliances, and the legitimacy of their heirs. Honor, therefore, was a form of collective property, zealously watched and defended with violence. Comparative perspectives. Medieval Europe was not a uniform bloc. Under the same sky, multiple legal systems, beliefs, and customs coexisted, shaping marriage and sexuality in different ways. While Latin Christianity imposed its rigid model of an indissoluble sacrament, other traditions such as Nordic, Jewish, and Islamic offered more flexible or pragmatic visions. Comparing these worlds allows one to understand to what extent the inhumane practices of the Dark Ages depended more on cultural context than on time. In the Latin Christian sphere, marriage was an absolute sacrament. The Church controlled the legitimacy of consent, the validity of consummation, and the morality of the bed. Female virginity was glorified, pleasure was considered dangerous, and the union had to serve the purpose of procreation. Canon law was strict, but not always consistent. It prohibited polygamy and divorce, although it tolerated forced marriages and conjugal violence. In practice, Christian morality oscillated between the ideal of purity and the reality of a patriarchal and pragmatic society. In Northern Europe, the Nordic peoples preserved pre-Christian customs for longer. In Scandinavia, Iceland, and parts of England, marriage had a contractual rather than religious character. Before Christianization, women could retain some autonomy. They had their own dowry, controlled part of their property, and in some cases could request divorce. The Icelandic Gragas, a 13th century legal code, allowed a wife to separate if her husband abandoned her or seriously mistreated her. However, this freedom was relative. With the arrival of Christianity, customs aligned with Roman doctrine, power returned to the husband, and female sexuality came under clerical supervision. Among Jewish communities in Europe, marriage was considered both a civil and religious act, but within a more defined legal framework. The ketubah, a marriage contract mandatory since antiquity, protected the wife through the promise of financial compensation in the event of divorce or widowhood. Divorce, although discouraged, was legal and could be requested by either party under certain conditions. Mosaic law recognized the possibility of separation without turning it into a sin. Nevertheless, inequality persisted. The husband could repudiate his wife more easily, and virginity remained a socially valued condition. Still, compared with Latin Christianity, the Jewish tradition showed a greater sense of contract than sacrament. In territories under Islamic rule, especially in Al-Andalus, marital norms were governed by Sharia, Islamic law. Marriage was a legal contract signed before witnesses with a stipulation of a dowry, mahr, in favor of the woman. Unlike the Christian system, this dowry was not given to the husband but belonged exclusively to the wife as economic security. A man could have up to 4 wives as long as he could maintain them justly. The woman, in turn, had to be monogamous. Divorce was permitted and could be initiated by either party, although in practice men had an advantage. Sexuality, though regulated, was not seen as a sin in itself, but as a natural expression subject to moral balance. The contrast between these cultures was particularly visible on the Iberian Peninsula, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted for centuries. In frontier cities such as Toledo or Zaragoza, courts applied different laws depending on the faith of the accused. The same act could be considered a mortal sin in a Christian neighborhood and a simple civil infraction in another. Religious conversions, forced or voluntary, also altered marital rights. A Jewish woman who was baptized could lose her dowry. A converted Muslim woman, on the other hand, gained the protection of Christian law but lost her divorce freedom. Faith defined intimate life with the same rigidity it defined politics. These differences did not imply tolerance but coexistence. Each system believed it held the moral truth and despised the rituals of others. Christian chroniclers described Islamic polygamy with horror. Jewish scholars criticized the hypocrisy of monks. Muslims saw Europeans as a mixture of lust and barbarism. The Middle Ages were a mosaic of overlapping obsessions, where women, regardless of religion, remained at the center of social control. Yet in all these worlds, marriage remained an institution linking the body to property, faith to duty, and fertility to honor. Legal differences barely concealed the same logic of domination, regulated desire, rewarded obedience, and shared guilt, and although laws varied, the risks were universal. Medieval health and medicine. In medieval Europe, the human body was a mystery interpreted more through faith than science. The wedding night, that seemingly intimate moment, could become a dangerous experience. Lack of hygiene, erroneous beliefs, and medical ignorance turned the marital bed into uncertain terrain. Where life should be celebrated, suffering often began. Doctors of the time, trained in monasteries or universities such as Salerno, Montpellier, or Bologna, based their knowledge on the texts of Galen and Hippocrates. The body was a system of humors that had to be kept in balance: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Diseases were attributed to an excess or deficiency of one of them, or to cosmic influences. In the marital context, this theory determined sexual health. It was believed that the act should be performed in moderation, on auspicious days, and never after overeating or during menstruation. Medicine mixed with superstition and religion dictated the rest. Widespread lack of hygiene aggravated the risks. Genital infections, wounds, or premature births were common. Most peasants were unaware of basic hygiene concepts, and access to clean water was limited. In cities, public baths were associated with sin and prostitution, so they were prohibited or controlled by the church. Consequently, women entered marriage uneducated about their own bodies and in constant fear of divine punishment. What science ignored, religion filled with guilt. Midwives were the only ones with practical knowledge about women's health. They knew how to stop bleeding, recognize pregnancies, or relieve pain with herbs, but their wisdom was tolerated only as long as it did not contradict doctrine. Male doctors, trained in ecclesiastical settings, distrusted them and accused them of manipulating hidden forces. In the following centuries, that suspicion would lead them to be persecuted as witches. However, in villages, they remained indispensable, caring for mothers, assisting births, and advising newlyweds on how to preserve the health of the bed. Female sexuality was a little explored territory and at the same time surrounded by myths. It was believed that a woman's pleasure was necessary for conception, and without it, semen could not find its seed. This idea, inherited from Arab and Greek thought, coexisted with Christian morality, which considered pleasure sinful. The result was a permanent contradiction. Women were urged to enjoy themselves to conceive, but condemned if they showed it. Many lived in fear, associating physical pain with religious duty and illness with punishment for disobedience. Pregnancy was a dangerous stage. Maternal mortality reached alarming figures. Lack of hygiene assisted births without proper instruments, and the absence of anatomical knowledge turned childbirth into a life-threatening risk. Puerperal infections were frequent, and many women died of fever a few days after delivery. Those who survived were weakened and often conceived again shortly after, pressured by social expectations to produce heirs. Motherhood was not a choice but an obligation. Medieval doctors also prescribed peculiar remedies for marital weakness. Men drank saffron infusions or deer horn powder to maintain virility. Women took mixtures of bitter herbs to cleanse the womb or revive the blood. Some treatments bordered on magic, carrying a wolf tooth or a piece of coral to increase desire. The line between medicine and witchcraft was so thin that they were often indistinguishable. Venereal diseases, although rarely recognized, existed. Doctors described them with euphemisms such as shameful sores or fevers of love. Their origin was attributed to internal imbalances or committed sins. Prostitutes, soldiers, and travelers were seen as carriers of moral contamination. Syphilis, which would peak in the 15th century, would forever transform the view of the body and sin. But long before that, fear of impurity already marked the intimate life of medieval marriages. Death, in the form of infection or failed childbirth, was always present in the bedroom. Marital union, a symbol of life and blessing, could become a sentence. Without hygiene, without knowledge, and under the weight of dogma, every contact was a risk. The medicine of the time did not cure, it prayed, balanced the humors, and trusted in God, the church, the bedroom, and morality. In the Middle Ages, the human body belonged to God, and the church claimed the right to dictate what should be done with it, even within marriage. The bedroom, that hidden and silent space, became a field of moral surveillance. There, between the sheets, the church saw not only the union of two souls, but also the possibility of sin. What should have been a natural act became a territory full of rules, warnings, and confessions. From the 12th century, theologians began to define precisely what was acceptable within the marital bed. Sex was to serve solely for procreation. Any other intention, such as pleasure, curiosity, or desire, was considered a deviation. Relations during menstruation, pregnancy, or on Sundays were venial sins. Positions considered unnatural could become mortal sins. Confessors' manuals detailed every possible fault meticulously, the time, frequency, words, even thoughts. Nothing escaped moral scrutiny. The conjugal act was conceived as a duty, not a choice. Spouses had the mutual obligation to satisfy the marital debt, a legal and theological expression defining the right of the other to be pleased. Refusal could be considered an offense against the sacrament. For the wife, this obligation meant renouncing the notion of consent. For the husband, it meant dominating without guilt. Theology justified male desire as a natural force while demanding purity and passivity from women. Sermons taught that a man should use his wife in moderation, just as a peasant uses the land given to him. Confessors played a central role in this control. In the silence of the confessional, they interrogated about marital intimacy. They asked if the spouses slept together, if they used illicit methods, or if they had felt undue pleasure. Anglo-Saxon penitentials, collections of moral norms, imposed specific penances, fasting, pilgrimages, or prolonged abstinence. A passionate kiss could be punished with 3 days of bread and water, a relation during Lent with 40. Guilt was part of marriage as much as love or obedience. The Church not only watched over the body, but also the intention. Desire had to submit to the divine will. Theologians warned that even within marriage it was possible to sin through excessive ardor or through carnal pleasure without purpose. Pleasure, instead of being celebrated, became suspect. For St. Thomas Aquinas, sexual intercourse was moral only when it imitated nature's procreation. Everything else was a sin of lust. Thus, marriage, although holy, was surrounded by an air of constant guilt. Spouses lived under the idea that loving too much could be as dangerous as not loving at all. In convents and monasteries, religious devoted entire treatises to the dangers of the flesh. Authors like Peter Lombard and William of Auxerre wrote about the temperance of marriage, warning that excess passion weakened the soul. Wives were advised to yield without desire, and husbands to moderate their impulse to avoid sin. Thus, the most human act became a spiritual test, an impossible balance between duty and penance. Despite its severity, the Church recognized the power of marital union to curb the moral chaos of the world. Better to marry than to burn in temptation, said St. Paul. Marriage was seen as a remedy against sin, a necessary evil to channel lust within acceptable limits. This paradoxical vision, in which sex was simultaneously remedy and guilt, shaped all medieval culture. Obedience replaced desire, and love became a form of discipline. In peasant homes, doctrine mixed with superstition. Priests blessed beds, hung crucifixes above them, and warned against the impure spirits that tempted during sleep. In cities, fraternities monitored the morality of families, punishing adulterers or excommunicating prostitutes. The control of sexuality became a political and spiritual instrument. Maintaining purity meant maintaining order. Over the centuries, this control penetrated so deeply into the collective consciousness that not even reformers could uproot it completely. Marriage, subjected to the judgment of the pulpit, was reduced to a choreography between faith and fear. And when the Church sealed with dogma the boundary between duty and desire, the human body lost its innocence. Because in the Middle Ages, even love had to confess its sins.